Thanks very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Higgo Jacobs. I'm part of the wine team with Strauss & Co. The reason that I'm part of the wine team for Strauss & Co. is that I sort of initiated the process for Strauss to start engaging with wine as an asset class and as part of their portfolio and the catalogue. I used to be involved with the Nederburg auction, which is now the Cape Fine and Rare auction, since 2011, I think. But that being a Distell vehicle, it always had limitations for me. And eventually, I always thought I wanted to do my own thing. And when I was introduced to Frank Kilborn, who's going to join us hopefully later, the whole thing just sparked. And these conversations started in 2018 with myself and Roland Peens from Wine Cellar, with the dream because we felt that the timing is right to elevate South African wine in this sort of context. And then in 2019, we launched it under Strauss. Some would say varying success. It's difficult in the beginning, and then last year in 2020 with lockdown and with people being at home, and we were sort of ahead of the curve with being online quite early on with live auctions online. The whole thing just sort of took a life form, which we're very grateful about. And in the beginning, maybe the prices were a little bit unrealistic because there was this massive enthusiasm, and it's now in a very good space for us because part of what we set out to do was really a formalizing of the secondary market for South African wine. So it should be sober pricing, so we're very happy where it is now. So the theme for tonight is we're stating the case for why it's a good idea to buy South African wine and keep them. And that really has a two-legged approach for me, because one is financial and the other one is aesthetic reasoning for keeping them, like the sensory reason for keeping them, and that's what we're building towards on the tasting towards the end. But I am certainly going to touch on the mathematic reason or the material reason also for buying and keeping them. I want to start off with these two quotes because they really sum up quite nicely what's happening what is still happening and what started happening in the South African wine scene about 5 years ago, and which is why we felt the timing was really important to do this. The first quote is by Neil Martin. He is, I think, fair to say the most important, or possibly after Jancis Robinson, the second most important, depending on your point of view, wine critic in the world at the moment. He took over from Robert Parker for the major categories, which is Bordeaux, California, and so forth. He said in his report in 2018 on South African wine, "I reiterate my claim that no country, no wine region has been as dynamic, progressive, or indeed as exciting as South Africa." So that's Neil Martin in 2018. And then Tim Atkin in his 2019 report said in 2019, South Africa is making the greatest wine in its history. Now, these, I think, if you guys follow South African wine quite closely, would now seem, they're not that surprising. I've worked in the South African wine industry. I just thought of it before saying it, like it's actually been a bit longer than 20 years, but let's say 20 years. If you said these things 20 years ago, it would have not been cuckoo, it would have just been wrong. Like, it's just, if you said it 10 years ago, some people, in certain contexts would have thought, well, this guy is actually touching on some interesting points, but it would have still been completely off the table. It's really a very recent movement of the world recognizing how good our wines are. And what we realize is ourselves, or from a Strauss point of view, is we think that the industry doesn't quite realize how good our wines are. And we're only now really starting to sort of claim that position and being ourselves, allowing to be ourselves. What is a fine wine? Basically, those three building blocks: taste, terroir, fine wine. For me, what I've always, in a simplified way, which most sort of international authorities agree on, is a fine wine would be a wine that shows its sense of place. Well, I think that's the primary thing, the terroir aspect. And then that it's ageable. So it doesn't mean that you can't drink it young, but there has to be an ageable property, that structure that allows development. Those two factors have been what I sort of attribute to it. I have participated, and I just want to read it to you because it's really sort of ongoing and current at the moment. There's this global case study by an institution called Arini Global. They identified as the changing definition of fine wine. A fine wine is complex, balanced, with a potential to age. Though highly drinkable at every stage of its development, It's a wine that provokes emotions and wonders in the one that's drinking it, while reflecting the expression of truth intended by its maker. It is environmentally, socially, and financially sustainable. That last sentence is actually quite interesting, that being brought in. That's sort of the new generation of thinking in terms of wine. But that sense of conveying the intention of the winemaker, conveying its sense of place, and the ageability of it, really. These are the factors. You can't do it without brand equity. So as an example of that, there certainly are, on a blind tasting level, some wines in South Africa that's completely undervalued. I can call out a lot of them, but I wouldn't want to insult the brands. But there are some fantastic wines that is in a label that doesn't quite justify where the wine is, and then therefore the price hasn't caught up with it. So you have to have that brand equity in terms of what's been done with the brand and the persons behind it. Critic ratings is big. If you guys follow the Tim Atkin report, you might have seen what happened with 100 point score ratings. It does have a big effect in terms of putting wines on the map. Price, so that sort of confidence of a producer releasing a wine at a high price sometimes is humbled by it because they have to eat humble pie and change their price. But bringing a price in line to international standards might seem arrogant. I remember, 10 years ago there was maybe a handful of wines that was around 500 Rand and above. Now there's quite a few that's above 1,000 Rand, and that's just more of a confidence that's growing in the industry. Rarity is a massive factor. We'll touch on that later, but think about some Grand Cru vineyard sites in Burgundy. That'll give you a very good sort of idea. It's a finite thing, and that's why supply demand, the price rise like that. Vintage, so for instance, 2015, 2017 being top vintages for the Cape, they do add and we're actually starting to see producers starting to consider factoring in vintage into their price, so in terms of their release. So you might see a producer selling their 2017 for more than they're selling the 2018, that sort of thing, so it would be interesting. And then provenance, in terms of how the wine has been stored, but also provenance of the producer itself. Okay, so those factors. So we've highlighted 3 wines. Initially, when we built this little presentation, we had more wines, but I want to try and get to the tasting. So the concept here is to just look at 3 wines as an example to illustrate the point of South African wines gaining in value and why they do. So this is the rare one, the cult one and the rare one that gains value because it's so finite. So the Mevrouw vineyard is a vineyard in Stellenbosch, and it is the oldest Chenin vineyard in the country. So being old, it has low yield, old bush vine, vineyard on its dryland farm. So it really gets, I think it's like a ridiculous amount, like 3 tons a hectare. It's like, it's unsustainable farming unless you get these sort of prices that Ibn Saadi has started introducing per bottle. So the reason that they grow in value that much is the rarity. The current vintage, which I think is still staggering, is 880 Rand. So this is a wine that to a large extent is immediately rare after release. You can't go, there's no tasting room to walk into and say, I'd like to buy more. You have to be on a waiting list for an allocation. I was telling my friend earlier that I've been bounced off the allocation because I didn't buy my last year, and even just said, okay, you're not on the list anymore. So it has that rarity immediately because it's so little in supply. It has an icon status. Then what we have quite controversially asked and started labeling, is this perhaps South Africa's finest wine? And the reason we say that is because it has that real footprint. So the Mevrouw Kirsten is fantastic, but there's only a couple of barrels of that made, so it doesn't really reach the world. This is now a proper proposition because it has volume. It has international footprint. So that's kind of why we're arguing that. And then on the back of that, Meerlus is one of our really established brands, have been making fine wines for a long time, sort of own this Bordeaux red blend space in South Africa, and they've been doing consistently estate made, so they're not trying to make more by buying fruit from all over and compromising on quality. They're doing the same thing and trying to improve it every year. So in that sense, it certainly is one of South Africa's fine wines, put it that way. And the staggering thing with that is it's still only 375 Rand on release. So, I mean, I'm not here to give tips on what to buy, but I don't think you can go wrong to buy Mealer's Rubicon. Critic scores around 93, 92, 94, around there. 2009 vintage we sold for 1,270, and the 82, which is a really very good vintage for the Cape, has sold for 4,000 Rand, which is 18% on annual return. The investment guys would know a bit better, but I think that's probably quite a good return. You know, it would be interesting to see if it does that for massive dumps in the market, but you know, in the sort of tension that's held between supply and demand, these are the returns that we're realizing. So the third example then is sort of the one to watch. So if you like look from an art point of view, an auction house like Strauss is able to sort of put some artists on the map if they really think that there's a young up-and-coming artist that's one to watch. Raoul would be one like that. It's sort of becoming established now already. But if you think, you know, 15 years ago, Ibn Sadi was up and coming, and now Sadi family vineyards is certainly part of the establishment in South African wine. So this would be a sort of a producer busy establishing itself, part of the new wave. The Raoul Red, 310 a bottle at the moment. Yeah, I think that's a steal. They do the Ava Chenin and the Ava Syrah, that's I think double that in price, but these sort of wines around 300, fantastic value. Critic scores 93, 94, and we sold 2015, that's just 2 vintages back, already for 1,000 Rand, so 270% growth. Okay. Any questions? You with me, yeah? So Chateau Libertas will come up again in a future slide. It's yeah, I almost don't want to say too much because I get emotional thinking about it, Chateau Libertas. It's South Africa's oldest red wine. It used to be South Africa's finest red wine. It's still one of the best aging. You know, if you have vintage, which I've had the fortune to have vintages from the 40s in fantastic condition. The 60s, so the top vintages of Chateau Libertas is some of our best wines, and it shows the ageability of vineyards in the Cape. Regardless of winemaking, it shows that our wines can last 50 and 100 years. We know our sweets can, but wines like that show that our red wines can as well. So it's an incredible wine that the brand equity has been destroyed. And there's a million reasons for that. I mean, it's a massive corporate machine, which I'm happy to chat to you about afterwards. Would be an interesting brand to revive, put it that way. There's still a lot of equity in it. But now at the moment, Chateau Libertas sells for, I think, 49 Rand on, you know, it's incredible. Investment wines, in terms of price and purchase power, over a period of time, I think they started the study in 2003. So it starts there when they zeroed it on 100, and that year is 2003. And it's basically, it's an incredibly interesting thing because in 2003, I think it was something like 94 Bordeaux wines, and then a handful of Italian, some Burgundy, and a Champagne or something like that. It was basically a Bordeaux index. Then what happened is that was in return on investment for these wines. They were climbing considerably until 2008. So that's that market crash with was it Lehman firm or whatever, the American, which was so. The interesting thing is wines like this. So if you buy Mevrouw Kirsten, for instance, if the market crashes, I don't think that wine's gonna fall in value. But this, it's like a age-old formalization of so Bordeaux en Premier is basically the investment. If you want to buy safe, then you buy Bordeaux en Premier wine. And they're quite exposed still to the market, even though it's a physical asset. Whereas if you buy something that's as unique and left field like Mevrouw Kirsten, the demand for that remains. We've seen it now with the COVID impact on the South African wine industry. These small production volume wines just keep their trend of growing in value. But this sort of trend did fall, and then started climbing again. But then what happened is it climbed So this period here is 2009 and 2010 and 11, and that's around when China started getting interested in Bordeaux. So that was a massive climb again. Chinese started buying, I think Lafite was the biggest thing because it had symbolic value and it was red colors, also positive and so forth. So China went bonkers and they have the spending powers over Bordeaux. And they started instituting bans on wine gifts and so forth, and the bottom fell out of Bordeaux a little bit. And then the market stabilized around. But what's interesting is around here that Burgundy started overtaking Bordeaux in terms of the amount of wines. So the Livex index is very dynamic in terms of that pool of wines. And what we'd like to see, and again, if you said this not 20 years ago, if you said this 10 years ago, that we'd like to see a South African wine in the top 100 investment wines in the world, you're smoking your socks. But the point being, Burgundy increased, few more champagnes, few more Italian wines. We'd like to start seeing some South African wines, and there's certainly some knocking on this. The interesting thing here is the analyzed return since 2004, excluding storage and things. So that's important. Like, wine has an added cost. Storage, insurance, these sort of things, especially fine wines. So the Livex since then, on average, since 2004, has been realizing around 7%, which sort of just beats inflation. Okay. South African wine, the right wines have been performing much better. Just touching on a few wine critics. So Robert Parker, from the Wine Advocate, he started it in the late 70s. He is the most influential wine critic that's ever lived, and it's unlikely that there will ever be, not because he was so special as a person, he was just a guy in the moment. And the world has changed a lot in terms of how people take critic information. It's become much more specialized, and we take a pool of information. This guy, at the time, the 1982 Bordeaux vintage, he sort of put it on the map, and he said this is going to be the vintage to buy. Other critics differed from him, and he was right. And he started developing a 100-point score system, which everybody now follow. And it was so accessible for consumers to understand. This wine is 94, and that one's 92, so I should buy the 94. And to give you an idea, Robert Parker, I think, maybe gave 5 South African wines above 90 points ever in his life. So just, supporting that point I made earlier, 20 years ago, nobody was giving South African wines scores in the 90s. Nobody. So yeah, he was just sort of timing-wise massively influential. Now it's really a cluster. I think some savvy consumers and wine enthusiasts would now realize that a guy like Tim Atkin probably likes the same style of wines that I like, so therefore I'm going to read Tim Atkin and so forth. So it's much more of a selection and a broader view, and you also take recommendations from the sommelier in the restaurant and from the merchant down in the wine shop and that sort of thing, where it was just the timing of Robert Parker. So all of these, the other ones, I mentioned Neil Martin earlier. He's now very pro South Africa as well. Jancis Robinson is probably still seen from the UK as the most prominent judge from South African context because of the work and the time that Tim puts into Master of Wine, Tim Atkin puts into South African wine. He does an annual report, like a 500-page South African report, and he tastes 1,800 wines from here. So nobody does that amount of work and that amount of promotion for South African wine on a global scene. So he's the most prominent one now for South Africa. And then the local ones, there's Platter, WineMag.co.za. Very good read, actually, WineMag, if you're into South African wine. They have some very good content. Greg Sherwood is a South African master of wine that lives in the UK. He's very pro-South African wine, so his scores are on the high end. Just a few notes on auctions. That bottle you might recognize is Romani Conti. So this is, in terms of fine wines of the world, we've touched on South African examples. This is the most rare and sought after and highly priced wine that you can find now. It's a Burgundy. It's Romani Conti is the vineyard. It's Grand Cru, and the producer is Domaine de la Romani Conti. This vintage is 1945. It was sold, the price is there, $558,000. That was in 2018. that's a bottle price, eh? So that was a record. That was Sotheby's record, yeah. So that's why I think, you know, I mean, there's plenty of reasons why a wine like that, it's built provenance. If we look at something like Sardi that I mentioned earlier, is quite established now already. His first vintage was in 2000, right? So what is that now, 20 years? He would be the first to admit it. He's trying to build a multi-generational thing. He's only just started. So it's really very, very young and very recent. Welgemeend Conti has been going for 300 years. So it's really, that's part of it, that provenance that they've built up over that longer period of time. The other reason is real estate, best place in the world to make Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is probably sort of the most highly regarded red wine. It's sort of where you arrive as a wine connoisseur. Some Cabernet fans might differ, but Pinot really is that sort of holy grail of wine. It's tough to make. You can't make it anywhere else as good as you can make it in certain areas in Burgundy, and the Welgemeend Conti is that vineyard where everybody regards it as the best. So it's a Grand Cru vineyard, and you can't grow it, because once you go out of Welgemeend Conti, you're in La Tâche, which is still very expensive, but a little bit less pricey, or you're in Echezeaux, or you're in Richburg, and they already have their prices. And you can maybe plant a vineyard exactly like that with the same clones and try and get the soils the same, different part of the world. It's not going to get it. It's not going to get the prices. So it's the rarity that drives it there. We have this, so we put that concept there. It's something I'll sort of just leave with you, the rare versus young concept, because it's something that we're still sort of defining and laying out. It's safer to be auctioning and trading younger wines. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so many producers making so little of fine wines in South Africa that there's immediately a rarity factor, because it's so little. The day after it's released, it's already rare. So we are able to trade wines. We actually have an age limit, so we certainly don't sell anything that's available in the market. And we're trying to sell 2015 in reds and older, and 2017 in whites and older. So to have some sort of age factor, but the wines at a young age already have a rarity to them. And you're cutting out a lot of risk if you're selling younger vintages, because as wines age, they obviously become more fragile and become more sensitive to all sorts of developmental issues. So it's an interesting one in terms of, you know, looking at the investment opportunity also on buying on auction in a younger wine, or these real rare. And we've got 2 auctions coming up that showcase that example quite well. The first auction on the 14th of September, we're selling 5 lots. And those 5 lots are 5 bottles of wine. And I mean, it might be optimistic in saying that, but we should be getting like $1 million. We're hoping to get $1 million in value for those 5 lots. So that's because it's extremely rare. And they're all South African wines. One of them is actually a Chateau Libertas on your question earlier, 1957. We've recorked it. I recorked it personally. It's and like everybody that tastes it starts crying, basically. The wine's fantastic. So 1 bottle of that, 1 bottle of GS 66, another really incredible, that's Cabernet Sauvignon, ageable red. 1 bottle of Vin Constance, the first vintage, 87. Then we found an 1821 Grand Constance that came through France to England and back to South Africa. So that's like from the old era of Constantia Sweets. That should, I mean, there's a handful of them left in the world, so that should be a very decent price. But anyway, so the point being, these examples are very rare, a handful of them still available. And then the auction immediately after that is a producer auction where we're featuring Ibn Saad of Sardi family wines, Villafante, and Alite. And that would be younger wines that have some age, and it's showing how those producers' wines can age, but they certainly don't have that sort of rarity factor.
Maybe it's our ignorance in asking the question, but is it still drinkable?
Yes.
1945 wine?
Definitely, and certainly also everything that we sell, we're not selling anything as collector's pieces for you to just look at. They all, so the lots on sale, for instance, with this sale, they've been recorked and tasted recently, and especially the sweet wines, they're fantastic. And, well, similarly the reds. So there would be auctions selling wines that the auctioneer don't stand behind, that the wines are still drinking very well. Unfortunately, there's also, I think, which is part of why we've done this and part of why we're doing it with an educational angle as well, is that we haven't valued ageability in South African wine, and the market has been skeptic for a reason, because people selling it have been storing it badly. We'll get to a storage slide, transporting it incorrectly. So eventually somebody is considering it for a moment, then being sold a Duff bottle and being told that that is fantastic just because it's old and rare, and you're drinking it and your instinct tells you this is rubbish. And I think we've really scorned quite a lot of our market, and we're trying to recover that. But what we know for a fact is that our wines are ageable, and if you look after them, then they improve well, and we're going to sort of try and look at it as a case in point with On the Table. But I completely get your question, but factually, I can say that sold on serious auctions like Strauss, Sotheby's, Christie's, so forth, it would be wines that are sold for their drinkable value. And people won't pay high prices if they don't believe that the wines are still drinking well. You must also realize that South African, so just to, I'm going to start with what you said towards the end. The concept of South African wines not aging well has a lot of factors applied to it. Our fine wine movement is quite a recent thing. You know, we've been a volume rather than a quality player. And I think the industry realized now that volume is not sustainable in the South African context. So we're starting to focus on quality, and we're doing it fantastically well with the right stuff planted. So the right varieties and the right things planted in the right places is what's really driving this quality revolution for South African wine, and the best is still yet to come. So we really don't think, or don't give up on South African wine in terms of ageability, and it's no exact science in terms of how long a wine can age. And the biggest reason for that is your preference is going to be different from mine, from Frank's. If you like a bit more primary fruit, then the wine for you peaks earlier than for me that likes more tertiary, secondary flavors in the wines. So therefore, it doesn't, you can't, I know Kanonkop did it for a while and stopped doing it to have that graph and saying, you know, this is when you drink the wine. Wine critics also give the wine drinking window, but you would see that they do it quite wide. They would see drink 2030 to 2060, you know. So it really, especially fine wines, it's usually very wide drinking windows. Just one more thing to touch on is the counterfeiting. These two guys, there's films made about them. So if you're interested, then Rudy Kuniwan's film is Sour Grapes. I'll say his film, it's not his film, but he's the subject of that film. And then Hardy Rodenstock is the Billionaire's Vinegar. And these are the two most famous names in wine counterfeiting in the world. Rudy just came out last year. He had a 10-year sentence that he did. It's a remarkable story. He was a serious wine collector, and he built himself this serious wine collector profile to then, because you can't just go and enter a market like this and immediately start fooling people. Like, he built up a real serious profile, had a lot of money, obviously, to invest, and then started selling counterfeit wines. And the way that he was caught out is what is the most interesting, is he was selling wines that didn't exist. But you have to be really well informed to know that these wines don't exist. And he was operating like that for quite a long time until some producers, notably Lafite and Domaine Ponceau in Burgundy, started, I mean, the owner saw this wine on sale that he realized they've never made. So if, like, Ponceau flew to, it was Akermel that sold it in the US and stopped the auction. So, but it's, I mean, it's just the sort of patience and guts that these guys had to have. And Hardy Rodenstock sold wines that he alleges was found in a wall in Paris and that belonged to Thomas Jefferson from the 18th century, and it had an inscription with a date on, it says TH.J for Thomas Jefferson, and it was Lafite from the 18th century. And this, I mean, the thing is with wines like this is it just captures people's imagination, because there isn't Lafite available from the 18th century. We know that they've made wine at the time. We know Thomas Jefferson was a vinophile, and he was a keen wine collector. So, and he spent time in Paris. So it's all very possible. But then once they started doubting Hardy Rodenstock, who sold it, and this was not because of Interpol, this was a private collector that realized something's amiss here. They started doing some investigation, and they were able to date wines, date bottles, look at factual stuff, and they realized, he's been found guilty and sentenced. So the reason we've sort of put that on there is it shows the appeal and the serious commercial interest behind fine wine. And we haven't found any counterfeit. There are counterfeit South African wine, but it's in the entry price point where people print a label and stick it on a bottle and sell an 80 Rand bottle of wine. And it's real easy to see. There's no sophistication in the counterfeiting. But I think that it would probably be a compliment for South African wine if the fine wines are starting to be counterfeited, because that shows that our value is now justifying that process. Because if you see what Rudy Koenigsegg did, it's not like a little quick job here. It's very, very sophisticated. He did it in his kitchen, but it's blending, because he was a very good taster, so he was blending certain vintages together to get closest to what he believed, let's say, what 1945 Hermione Conti tasted like. Then you would blend 2 or 3 other wines, get the labeling correct, the wax again, and so forth. So if we have people starting to do that in South African wine, it would be bad news. We're on the lookout for that, obviously, but it would be a compliment to what's happening in the South African wine scene. Okay, we need to get to the wines. So just a little bit on the industry today, where we're standing. This is interesting. South Africa, this is the sort of average of what wines above 90 point cost in 2014. It was just a little study that was done, wine scoring in the Wine Spectator, above 90 points. In the year 2014, they worked out an average. An average above 90 score French wine is $106. South African wine is $40, the cheapest of all of them. Again, just showing how we undervalue our wines. The other interesting thing to look at is our most expensive wine is 200 times more than our cheapest one. So let's say the cheapest wine you can buy in a shop in South Africa is 25 Rand or something. Then the most expensive one is 200 times that. That's not very far apart. If you look at France, 10,000 times the price of the cheapest to the most expensive. So you might say that that's a bad thing if the wines are that far apart, but it is a good thing because what I mentioned earlier, a big part of wine is just sold as a consumer goods, bought in a supermarket, drunk today. There's nothing wrong with that. There's awesome wines in that context, but if we look at fine wine, that's something that has a finite number. It's justified for these wines to accelerate in price. And we haven't really achieved that. We're starting to see that and achieving that in South African scene. Some people that contribute to that movement, Ibn Sadi, Rosa Krier. If you're interested in old vines, she's really the personality behind putting old South African vineyards on the map. And the fine wine, you can't say fine wine in South Africa without thinking of what older vineyards give us, especially in the white wines of Shannon. And then this sort of new wave, the Swartland Revolution, new wave producers doing, and it's all to do with the right material in the right sites. So it's a viticultural drive more than anything else. And then the world authorities, the critics, starting to call our wines out for being great. The first perfect score, Tim Atkin giving. So there's an interesting little sum that I did the other day because I assist Tim with the report. And there's a lot of people, and interestingly, very few international, if any, I don't know any, but a lot of local wine journalists talking about critics like Tim Atkin. They call it score inflation. Overscoring South African wines, saying these guys are just trying to get the attention. I suppose there's a little bit of credibility in that. So the argument is that if a guy gives a really high score, then he's going to get media attention because he's given a high score, so it's good for somebody to give a high score. What these critics are saying is, you fools, you're not realizing how good your own wines are, and you in your own country are actually talking your wines down. I'm not going to talk too much about storage because I want to get to the wine tasting, but basically what this slide says is storage is very important. If you want to know how to store your wines correctly in a cellar, come chat to me afterwards. Temperature, keeping it the same, these factors. But there are professional storage facilities like Wine Cellar. There's others as well available in South Africa. So if you don't have the capacity to build a serious cellar at home, because just a cool, dark place in the closet doesn't quite cut it, so it has to especially if you want to buy to resell, then rather keep it in a professional cellar. Transports and retailers, I mean, don't buy from a retailer if you're not confident that they are fine wine people, because then they wouldn't have handled the wine well in terms of how the whole value chain happened. So be aware of that. And then insurance is just on there to note that it is, for fine wines, it's something that adds to your costing per year. There's the Chat Lip again. 1970 is also quite tasty. I'm mostly gonna skip over this because it sort of ties into the tasting. So I've been talking mostly about the investment reason for keeping wine. This is also to just show the aesthetic reason for keeping wine, or the sensory reason for keeping wine. I want to make the point strongly that we're not saying that the wine necessarily gets better as it gets older. I'm not trying to convince you to drink your wines older. Everybody would have a certain sort of preference on an age spectrum where you prefer drinking your wines. That's completely something for you to decide. This is just sort of showing what the wine looks like when it's quite young and what it looks like in a certain period of time down the line. So what we have is Welgemeend GVB Red. This is the Bordeaux red blend from Welgemeend. So it's Cabernet Sauvignon mostly, quite dominantly Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. It's only those three varieties. Three varieties in sort of similar fashion, always more Cabernet Sauvignon. And the wine on the left is 2019. So that would be quite safely considered too young to be drinking this wine. It doesn't mean, because remember that definition that I gave you in the beginning of fine wine. A fine wine should be good at any stage of its life. And that's why I quite like that definition. It doesn't mean that it should be undrinkable, but the wine is just so closed and so tight and so tannic. And it shows a lot of primary fruit, sort of black currant.
And then very tarty at the tannins.
Like really sort of dries your palate out and grips.
Juvenile in character on the left, and then
Juvenile, and then getting more sort of balanced. I like the word of balance, getting more at peace with itself.
structure to intertwine with age.
Absolutely. I think, Cabernet, you can certainly make Cabernet to drink young, but Cabernet by definition, if it's made as a serious wine, is ageable. It's got structure. It develops. So when a wine like this is young, it has two things that can influence its flavor: the grape variety and where it's come from. And this is Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Cabernet Franc from Stellenbosch. So it has that sort of a sense of a character, and then the wood, which is sort of the winemaker's hand. The winemaker spices the oak. Those are the levels of complexity that you have in a young wine. With time, there's what we call secondary and tertiary flavors that develop from the bottle age. There's complexity that come with the softening of the acidity, the softening of the tannins. The wine actually drops a little bit of color, which is the sediment settling out, and it becomes softer and more approachable. And it would lose some of that primary fruit flavors and get more earthy or stewed fruits. So again, your preference would be somewhere on the scale. So the one on the left, first one, 2019, that's what it looks like, because it's not labeled yet. Welgemeend did this for me to just sort of include it in this tasting. They're currently selling 2014. World's first. That's André van Rensburg's. It looks like a doctor's handwriting, Welgemeend. And then the glass in the middle is 2009. So that's now sort of 10 years down the line. I think plenty of people would prefer the 2009 because it still has quite a bit of that robust structure, but it has softened a little bit and it's gained some complexity. The interesting thing with the 2009 for me is, 2009 was one of the top vintages of the Cape of the last decades. And I think the wine's really good, but this is the wine that shows the most sort of what we call methoxypyrazines, that grassy, herbaceous flavor profile to it. So it's big wine, lots of character, but really quite peppery. I think somebody guessed it as Syrah. That might be the reason. It's the pepperiness of it. So it does deviate quite a bit. But if you just look at the completeness of the wine, like it sits much better on the palate, and it reaches your. It just makes a much better impression than the first wine.
Higgo, but didn't they change winemaker in this process at least once, I think, or not?
No, so this is all under van Rensburg, at least a cellar master. Yeah.
Okay.
And the wood regime is very similar. So this is the reason that we show Vergelegen, is because it's quite consistent in terms of how they're made. And it's also a producer that doesn't quite shoot the lights out in terms of what's happened with them. Like Kanonkop has had this kind of new lease of life, and the wines are gaining traction a lot. Vergelegen sort of ticks over. They haven't done that much with the brand, but they still focus on quality a lot, especially with the Bordeaux varieties, and we sell them on auction. But this is all new wood every year, mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, same vineyard, same style of winemaking. So it really is just a vintage difference, and then the age in the bottle that's giving you a difference in the taste profile. Third wine is 1999, so that's another 10 years down the line, and so they've changed the packaging a little bit, but it's really the same blend, the GVB blend. So what happens with age? Those are the three: young, medium, and fully mature. So left, middle, and right. But then we've been selling them, so it's just interesting to note the Vergelegen prices. So the current vintage that's selling is 2014. We're not tasting 14, we're tasting 19, because we wanted to do that 10-year jump, and we really wanted to show you a wine that Vergelegen is one of the few producers that do this. That's selling a wine, holding it back. If you look at Meerlus, for instance, that's the value of the wine as it sits in a shop. It's 640 Rand, today's price. We've sold the most recent vintage that we've sold was 2011. We sold that in 2019 when the auction wasn't achieving necessarily the highest prices. We sold for 720. 2010 vintage we've sold this year for 780. So, you know, I'm showing you a sort of a sober brand like Vergelegen that's gaining at a gradual pace. The GVB Red 2005 sold 1173 this year, so that's a nice appreciation. 01 the same price. 2000 good vintage. That was a steal, but that was in 2019. We did get the top prices, and then last year we've done really well with the 98, 1,950. So, but basically, like compound, I think I wrote it down, but I think year on year it's around 7% for the Vergelegen, which is beating inflation, and it's similar to what the LiveX Top 100 does, but it's not doing 600% like Mevrouw Kirsten's done. Still a good proposition, but we're trying to sort of convince you to not necessarily just buy to sell, but to buy because of the joy that the wine gives after time. Excuse me, Lizelle. So the concept that and I say this with a fair amount of confidence because of me having been involved in all the other wine auctions in South Africa. The way that we've treated wine auctions is, let's try and get the people drunk in the room and try and get silly prices and put the winemaker there or the owner with slaps on the back and so forth. It has its. I'm not saying that's bad, but that's generally, for me, preferable for like a charity auction and so forth. What we're trying to do is a formalization of the secondary market for South African wine, and that I think is a sober process. But yes, it kind of doesn't make sense with the product, but.
I wanted to kind of ask a bit about primary market value and then also about secondary market. But in terms of varietal, I know that the big varietals are the older wines that we're all known with. But South Africa's big asset, in a big sense, is one of the youngest wines in the world, which is Pinotage. And where does that factor younger varietal, which in its inception was completely frowned upon. It's still kind of a wine that is loved to be hated and hated to be loved.
Yeah.
Where does that factor in? And then with Canoncorp and its lineage of winning winemaker of the year 3 times and wine producer of the world a few times at the International Wine and Spirits Competition, and how does that factor into the brand equity globally and the impact on the primary market value and secondary market value of a brand?
That's a cool question. I like that because Pinotage is globally, unfortunately, still quite frowned upon, and largely so for a very good reason. So let's start factual things to start with. We do sell Pinotage, but we sell Pinotage that has all of these. Remember that slide that had all the pointers of a fine wine? There's 4 that we sell that has that.
What is that?
This. So brand equity, high critic ratings, that's very hard to come by. So it's internationally, Pinotage doesn't have a good reputation. I'm actually busy, part of a movement with Anthony Hamilton Russell, who makes an Ashbourne Pinotage at a high price point, to do a rebranding for the Pinotage that makes stylistically fresher, lighter styles of Pinotage, and we've got a whole plan for that. The reason for that is that if you try and engage, especially sommeliers, buyers, supermarket buyers, restaurant buyers internationally, I want you to taste this Pinotage, they're not interested because of this reputation that it has, but also rightly so. I mean, it's not something that is hated just because it's South African. Let me tell you that there's a reason, but Pinotage does have a place in fine wine category, but it has to tick all of these boxes, and again, that's very few. Canoncorp Pinotage is one of them. Black Label Pinotage from Canoncorp is another. So it's not a category that I would get lyrical about and say, I think go and buy up all the Pinotage because in 10 years that's going to be the appreciating one. But what's happening in South African wine, the positive movement in terms of what's happening in viticulture, in terms of what's happening in winemaking across the board is happening in Pinotage as well. And that's lifting Pinotage up. And we are making some stellar Pinotage, but I don't quite see that ever being sitting comfortably among the world's best Bordeaux and Burgundies. It's not quite.
Just explain what corked means and what they're 2 different, people think that cork is bad.
TCA is the technical term for it. Trichloroanisole is the scientific name. It's something that lives in cork. So this is the 99's cork. It's beautiful cork. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that cork. That shows you quite a good indication of storage and in terms of whether it's been leaking and seeping. Also, there was a slide on that, but I sort of ran through it because I was aware of time. But things like leakage on the capsule, ullage is what we call, so the full height, if the wine is in the neck or in the shoulder. If a younger wine has a lot of ullage, it means the wine's been stored badly because it's pushed the cork and pushed the wine out. So these sort of indications is something that will point you to premature aging and possible oxidation. You cannot see anything wrong with a wine that would have corkage. And the likelihood of a wine being corked is exactly the same in the 2019 as it is in the 99. Doesn't get worse in time, doesn't get more likely in time. It's 100% to do with the quality of the cork, and we're getting better at that.
Like woefully undervalued. Now, it's good news for us who drink it, and it shows that we've still got a job to do, but it's a hell of a lot better than 3 years ago.
Well, let's put it this way, if this presentation had a subtitle, it would be that South African wines are undervalued. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make the whole time. But again, the reason that we're calling it a sober exercise is it's been so short that I think there's too many other factors. Like in 2019, there weren't enough buyers in the room, so that's a factor in terms of that. Where was the price settled, and people were buying bargains. Then last year, beginning of lockdown, there was a little bit of a craze of people going a bit nuts, like the world is ending. We might just as well just buy. No, exactly. It's what it looked like to us because people were, I mean, you're obviously appreciative for good prices, but you're also going, I kind of hope it stops because now you're getting criticism from people going, it looks indulgent.
Yeah, we're sorry and with
Exactly. So what we like to see is this sort of realistic, pragmatic increase in the value in South African wines, which is not a Strauss movement, it's a South African wine industry movement that's happening. And it's just important to show that the wines do age well and that they also gain in value as they do so. And at the moment, it seems like a very, very good investment proposition as well because they're still so undervalued. That whole point of if you compare them with the international best, European, California, Australia, and so forth, those wines are all more expensive. You only need to travel once with the Rand to some expensive restaurants in Europe or America to realize how cheap we drink great wine in South Africa. It's like a simple thing.